Rome, March 18, 41 AD. The Circus Maximus erupts in thunderous applause as 250,000 spectators witness something unprecedented in Roman history. In the imperial box, draped in silk and gold, sits a figure that defies comprehension. A 12-year-old boy wearing the purple of absolute power, casually ordering the execution of senators with the same indifference most children show when discarding broken toys. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by his childhood nickname Caligula or Little Boot, raises his jeweled hand, and a man dies. He giggles, and a family is erased from existence. He yawns, and Rome trembles. The crowd cheers not from joy, but from the primal fear that recognizes a predator wearing the mask of innocence. But how does a beloved child prince, once the darling of Roman legions, transform into history's most psychopathic emperor? How does a boy who charmed hardened soldiers become a man who declared war on the sea itself and claimed to have conversations with the moon? The answer lies buried in 4 years of systematic psychological destruction, 4 years that would shatter a young mind and forge it anew in the furnaces of imperial paranoia and sexual depravity. This is not merely the story of one mad emperor. This is the dark blueprint of how absolute power, applied to a developing mind already fractured by trauma, creates monsters that reshape the very definition of evil. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, corruption, and the terrifying fragility of the human psyche. The child who entered Tiberius's court still possessed fragments of innocence. The emperor who emerged would make even seasoned Romans, people who considered gladiatorial combat entertainment, recoil in horror. This is the story of that transformation and why it matters more than ever in our modern world. To understand the monster, we must first meet the child who captured an empire's heart. Born in 12 AD in Antium, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus entered the world as Roman royalty's most precious commodity, a direct descendant of both Julius Caesar and Augustus, carrying the genetic legacy of Rome's greatest leaders. His father, Germanicus Caesar, embodied everything Romans admired: military brilliance, moral integrity, and genuine love for his soldiers. Unlike typical Roman commanders who viewed their legions as expendable resources, Germanicus shared their dangers, ate their food, and mourned their losses. When he brought his family to Germanic frontier camps, it wasn't political theater, it was authentic connection. Young Gaius became the legion's unofficial mascot. Soldiers crafted miniature military boots for the toddler, leading to his nickname Caligula, Little Boot. But this wasn't mere sentimentality. The hardened veterans of Rome's most brutal campaigns genuinely adored this bright-eyed boy who stumbled through their camps, mimicking their drills and chattering endlessly about military strategy. Contemporary accounts describe a child of remarkable intelligence and charisma. Historians noted his ability to memorize entire speeches after hearing them once, his talent for languages that allowed him to converse with Germanic prisoners, and his uncanny ability to read adult emotions and motivations. These gifts, which should have elevated him to greatness, would instead become weapons of unprecedented destruction. The family's popularity created a dangerous political situation. Germanicus's military successes and public adoration threatened Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son, who had inherited the throne through political maneuvering rather than popular acclaim. When Germanicus died suddenly in 19 AD, many suspected poisoning. His widow Agrippina the Elder became a focal point for anti-Tiberius sentiment. 7-year-old Caligula thus entered adolescence as both a political asset and liability. His bloodline made him invaluable to those seeking legitimacy, while his family's popularity made him a target for imperial paranoia. The psychological pressure of carrying such expectations while grieving his beloved father created the first cracks in what would become a catastrophically fractured psyche. The early warning signs were subtle but telling. Caligula began displaying an unusual fascination with power dynamics, carefully observing how adults responded to different forms of authority. He would manipulate household slaves through strategic kindness and cruelty, testing the boundaries of his influence with scientific precision. His education reflected Roman elite expectations: rhetoric, philosophy, military history, and Greek literature. But unlike his peers who absorbed these subjects academically, Caligula studied them tactically. He memorized Cicero's speeches not for their literary merit, but for their persuasive techniques. He read Thucydides not for historical knowledge, but for insights into political manipulation. Most disturbing were his theatrical performances. Roman aristocrats often staged private dramatic productions, but Caligula's interpretations revealed something darker. When portraying tragic heroes, he displayed an unsettling ability to access genuine emotion, suggesting either remarkable acting talent or alarming psychological instability. His performances of death scenes were so convincing that household staff genuinely feared for his safety. The young prince also began showing signs of sexual precociousness that troubled his tutors. Roman culture was relatively permissive regarding sexuality, but Caligula's interests went beyond normal adolescent curiosity. He questioned slaves about intimate details of their relationships, observed coupling animals with intense focus, and made inappropriate comments about adult women's bodies. These behaviors, individually minor, formed a pattern that modern psychology would recognize as early indicators of psychopathy. Superficial charm, manipulation of others, lack of empathy, and inappropriate sexual interests. But in ancient Rome, such traits were often misinterpreted as signs of future leadership potential. The turning point came in 26 AD when Tiberius, increasingly paranoid and reclusive, decided to bring 14-year-old Caligula to his stronghold on the island of Capri. This decision, ostensibly meant to provide the boy with direct imperial education, would instead subject him to 4 years of systematic psychological and sexual abuse that would transform Rome's golden child into history's most depraved monster. Capri in 26 AD was not the picturesque retreat of modern imagination, but a carefully constructed prison of perverted pleasure. Emperor Tiberius, now 67 and consumed by paranoid delusions, had transformed the island into a laboratory for his darkest impulses. When 14-year-old Caligula arrived, he entered what historians euphemistically called the Palace of Debauchery, a place where the boundaries between education and exploitation had been deliberately obliterated. The island's infrastructure reflected its sinister purpose. Hidden chambers connected through secret passages allowed for constant surveillance. Soundproof rooms prevented screams from carrying. Most chilling were the pleasure gardens, landscaped areas where Tiberius staged elaborate sexual performances involving slaves, prisoners, and young aristocrats compelled to participate. Caligula's initial accommodations seemed luxurious: silk furnishings, exotic foods, access to the finest libraries in the Roman world. But this comfort masked a carefully designed system of psychological conditioning. The boy was assigned tutors who were actually skilled manipulators, trained to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities. The process began with isolation. Caligula was separated from any positive influences, cut off from correspondence with family members, and surrounded exclusively by individuals loyal to Tiberius. This created psychological dependency. The emperor became his only source of approval, affection, and security. Next came the gradual normalization of deviance. Caligula was initially shielded from the island's most extreme activities, but slowly exposed to increasingly disturbing scenes. He witnessed elaborate tortures presented as entertainment, observed forced sexual acts described as education, and participated in mock executions framed as political lessons. The psychological impact was devastating. Caligula's developing brain, already traumatized by his father's death and family persecution, proved unable to process these experiences healthily. Instead of developing normal moral boundaries, he began to view extreme behavior as evidence of power and sophistication. Tiberius employed sophisticated psychological techniques that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. He used intermittent reinforcement, alternating between extreme kindness and casual cruelty, to create emotional dependency. One day, Caligula might be praised as the future of Rome and showered with gifts. The next, he might be forced to watch a suspected traitor being slowly tortured to death. This unpredictability served multiple purposes. It prevented Caligula from developing stable emotional responses, made him hypersensitive to the emperor's moods, and created a desperate need to please his captor. The boy learned to read microexpressions, anticipate desires, and adapt his personality to match Tiberius's expectations. The sexual exploitation began gradually. Roman culture already blurred lines regarding young people's sexuality, but Tiberius pushed far beyond social norms. Caligula was initially forced to observe sexual acts between adults and children, with these scenes presented as natural expressions of power. He was then gradually encouraged to participate, first as an observer, then as a participant. The psychological framework was brilliant in its cruelty. Tiberius convinced Caligula that these experiences were privileges, signs of the emperor's special favor and preparation for future leadership. The boy was told that normal Romans couldn't understand such sophisticated pleasures, that his participation demonstrated his superiority over common people. This reframing was crucial to the psychological damage. Instead of processing the abuse as victimization, Caligula learned to view it as evidence of his special status. The trauma became intertwined with his sense of identity and self-worth, making it impossible to reject without rejecting himself. The island's other residents reinforced these messages. Slaves were taught to treat Caligula as a deity, prostrating themselves and competing for his attention. Visiting dignitaries were instructed to seek his favor, even as a teenager. This artificial elevation fed his growing narcissism while isolating him from genuine human connection. The most insidious aspect of Caligula's conditioning was its systematic destruction of empathy. Tiberius understood that creating a functional psychopath required eliminating the subject's ability to emotionally connect with others' suffering. The process was methodical and horrifying. Caligula was forced to participate in increasingly severe punishments of slaves and prisoners. Initially, he was merely required to watch, but gradually he was encouraged to suggest methods, then to participate directly. Each act of cruelty was framed as a lesson in leadership. Future emperors needed to understand that mercy was weakness and that causing fear was more effective than inspiring love. The psychological techniques were sophisticated beyond their time. Tiberius used cognitive dissonance to break down Caligula's remaining moral restraints. The boy would be forced to perform acts that violated his conscience, then praised for his strength and imperial character. This created internal conflict that could only be resolved by adopting the perpetrator's worldview. Dehumanization was another key element. Slaves and prisoners were consistently referred to as animals or objects, while their suffering was described as natural or necessary. Caligula learned to view non-elites as fundamentally different species, lacking genuine feelings or rights. This psychological framework would later enable his most extreme cruelties as emperor. The island's atmosphere of constant surveillance and potential violence created chronic hypervigilance. Caligula developed an obsessive need to control his environment, interpreting any unexpected event as a potential threat. This psychological state, combined with his growing sense of omnipotence, would later manifest as the paranoid megalomania that characterized his reign. Perhaps most damaging was the complete absence of genuine emotional connection. Every relationship on Capri was transactional, based on power, fear, or manipulation. Caligula never experienced unconditional love, honest friendship, or authentic intimacy. He learned to view all human interactions as strategic games where empathy was a dangerous vulnerability. By his third year on the island, observers noted dramatic changes in the young prince's personality. His childhood spontaneity had been replaced by calculated charm. His natural curiosity had become strategic information gathering. His previous emotional expressiveness had transformed into carefully controlled performances designed to achieve specific outcomes. The final phase of Caligula's transformation occurred during his fourth year on Capri, when Tiberius began preparing him for potential succession. This period involved the most intensive psychological conditioning, as the emperor sought to create a ruler who would continue his methods while being completely loyal to his memory. The early months of Caligula's reign seemed to confirm Rome's highest hopes. The 25-year-old emperor freed political prisoners, restored democratic processes, and distributed lavish gifts to citizens and soldiers. His apparent generosity and charm reminded Romans of his beloved father Germanicus, creating an atmosphere of optimism that hadn't existed since Augustus's golden age. But this benevolent behavior was merely another performance, carefully calculated to build popular support before revealing his true nature. Caligula understood that absolute power required a foundation of public approval, and his years of psychological conditioning had taught him exactly how to manipulate mass emotions. The mask began slipping after his first year in power. Initially, the changes were subtle, casual executions of suspected enemies, increasingly elaborate public spectacles, and gradual erosion of traditional Roman institutions. But as Caligula's confidence grew, so did his willingness to indulge the darkest impulses that Capri had cultivated. His first major atrocity involved the systematic torture and execution of his own family members. Using fabricated charges of treason, he eliminated potential rivals while savoring their psychological torment. He forced his grandmother Antonia to watch her grandson's execution, then had her killed the following day. These acts served both practical and psychological purposes, removing threats while satisfying his appetite for suffering. The sexual depravity that had been normalized on Capri exploded across the Roman Empire. Caligula demanded sexual access to senators' wives, forcing husbands to watch their violations. He established brothels in the imperial palace, compelling aristocratic women to work as prostitutes. Most shockingly, he publicly engaged in incestuous relationships with his sisters, presenting these acts as divine privileges that elevated him above human moral restrictions. The psychological mechanisms driving Caligula's behavior reflected his Capri conditioning with terrifying precision. He displayed the same inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality that had characterized Tiberius's final years, but amplified by youth and absolute power. His delusions of divinity weren't mere megalomania. They were logical extensions of the worldview that had been systematically implanted during his formative years. His torture methods showed clear influences from his island education. The techniques he employed, psychological manipulation, sexual humiliation, prolonged suffering, directly mirrored those used against him. But Caligula's innovations demonstrated that he had not only absorbed his lessons, but surpassed his teachers in creative cruelty. The emperor's relationship with power revealed the complete success of his conditioning. He viewed authority not as responsibility, but as license for unlimited self-indulgence. Every traditional Roman virtue, honor, mercy, justice, had been redefined as weakness or hypocrisy. He genuinely believed that his desires, no matter how extreme, were natural expressions of divine will. Perhaps most disturbing was his complete inability to form genuine emotional connections. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming and charismatic, but also note that his relationships were entirely transactional. He felt no love, friendship, or loyalty, only strategic calculations about how others might serve his interests or threaten his position. The paranoia that had been cultivated on Capri exploded into empire-wide terror. Caligula saw conspiracies everywhere, interpreting innocent conversations as treason and casual gestures as threats. His response was systematically brutal: mass executions, public tortures, and elaborate psychological warfare designed to paralyze potential opposition through fear. The most revealing aspect of Caligula's reign was his treatment of children. Having been systematically abused as a child himself, he showed particular cruelty toward young people, as if punishing his former innocent self. He forced children to watch their parents' executions, sexually exploited minors from aristocratic families, and devised elaborate games that involved child suffering. This pattern reflects a common psychological mechanism among abuse survivors who become abusers themselves. Unable to process their own victimization healthily, they attempt to gain control by inflicting similar trauma on others. But Caligula's version was uniquely systematic and extreme, reflecting the sophisticated conditioning he had received. His innovations in public entertainment revealed the complete corruption of his moral framework. The gladiatorial games that had always been brutal became exercises in creative sadism. He would force audience members to participate in combat, order mass executions during intermissions, and design scenarios specifically to maximize psychological trauma for both participants and observers. The economic destruction of the Roman Empire reflected his complete inability to distinguish between personal desires and state resources. Within 2 years, he had bankrupted the treasury through lavish personal spending, impossible construction projects, and elaborate public spectacles. When funds ran low, he implemented innovative taxation schemes that were essentially legalized robbery. His military campaigns demonstrated the same disconnection from reality. He declared war on the sea, ordering soldiers to attack waves with their swords and collect seashells as spoils of victory. He planned to make his horse a consul, apparently believing that divine emperors could redefine the nature of governmental positions through pure will. The international implications of Caligula's reign revealed how individual psychological trauma could destabilize entire civilizations. His erratic behavior confused Rome's enemies and allies alike, creating diplomatic chaos that would have long-term consequences for imperial security. His relationship with religious institutions showed how his conditioning had corrupted even spiritual concepts. He declared himself a god, demanding worship from citizens and establishing temples for his own veneration. This wasn't mere political theater. Contemporary accounts suggest he genuinely believed in his divine nature, reflecting the complete success of his psychological conditioning. The resistance that eventually emerged against his rule demonstrated the limits of fear-based governance. While terror could suppress opposition temporarily, it couldn't create genuine loyalty or sustainable political institutions. The conspiracies that ultimately led to his assassination were driven not by political ambition, but by desperate self-preservation. The assassination itself, on January 24, 41 AD, was carried out by his own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect his life. The fact that his closest protectors chose to kill him rather than continue serving reveals the complete breakdown of trust and loyalty that characterized his reign. His death at age 28 ended one of history's most psychologically damaged reigns, but the trauma he inflicted on Roman society would have lasting consequences. The institutional damage, economic devastation, and psychological scarring of the population would influence Roman politics for generations. The advanced education focused on what Tiberius called the true nature of power. Caligula was taught that traditional Roman virtues, honor, mercy, justice, were propaganda tools used to control the masses. Real power, he learned, came from others' fear of your unpredictability and the knowledge that you were willing to do anything to maintain control. This education was practical rather than theoretical. Caligula was given administrative responsibilities over the island's operations, including oversight of punishments, allocation of resources, and management of the slave population. These responsibilities were designed to normalize extreme behavior while building his confidence in wielding absolute authority. The psychological impact was profound. Caligula discovered that he possessed a natural talent for manipulation and intimidation. He could reduce hardened soldiers to tears with a few well-chosen words, inspire desperate loyalty through strategic kindness, and create paralyzing fear through casual threats. These abilities, which should have been channeled toward positive leadership, instead became tools for satisfying his growing appetite for control and suffering. Sexual exploitation reached its peak during this period. Tiberius introduced Caligula to what he called imperial privileges, the right to use anyone on the island for sexual gratification, regardless of their age, gender, or consent. These acts were presented as natural expressions of imperial power, with resistance framed as treason against the state. The psychological framework was brilliantly cruel. Tiberius convinced Caligula that these experiences were privileges, signs of the emperor's special favor and preparation for future leadership. The boy was told that normal Romans couldn't understand such sophisticated pleasures, that his participation demonstrated his superiority over common people. This reframing was crucial to the psychological damage. Instead of processing the abuse as victimization, Caligula learned to view it as evidence of his special status. The trauma became intertwined with his sense of identity and self-worth, making it impossible to reject without rejecting himself. The island's other residents reinforced these messages. Slaves were taught to treat Caligula as a deity, prostrating themselves and competing for his attention. Visiting dignitaries were instructed to seek his favor, even as a teenager. This artificial elevation fed his growing narcissism while isolating him from genuine human connection. The most significant development during this period was Caligula's creation of what modern psychology would recognize as a sophisticated antisocial personality. He learned to mimic normal emotional responses while feeling nothing, to display charm while planning cruelty, and to inspire love while being incapable of reciprocating it. This psychological adaptation was partially protective. The complete absence of genuine empathy shielded him from the emotional pain of his situation. By viewing others as objects rather than people, he avoided the psychological torment of recognizing his own victimization. But this protective mechanism came at a catastrophic cost. It made him fundamentally incapable of normal human connection. Tiberius recognized and encouraged this development. He praised Caligula's strength in remaining unaffected by others' suffering, his wisdom in prioritizing self-interest over sentiment, and his imperial character in viewing mercy as weakness. These messages reinforced the boy's psychological defenses while channeling them toward increasingly antisocial behavior. The emperor also began testing Caligula's loyalty through increasingly extreme demands. The young prince was required to betray confidences, participate in elaborate cruelties, and demonstrate his commitment to Tiberius's worldview through actions that violated every remaining moral boundary. Each successful test strengthened his conditioning while eliminating potential sources of resistance. By 30 AD, contemporary observers noted that 18-year-old Caligula had become almost unrecognizable from the charming child who had arrived 4 years earlier. His smile never reached his eyes, his laughter carried undertones of menace, and his casual conversation often included disturbing references to violence and death. Yet he maintained perfect social functionality, charming visitors, and displaying apparent loyalty to Tiberius. The transformation was complete when Caligula began independently devising new forms of entertainment for the island. His innovations in torture, sexual exploitation, and psychological manipulation impressed even Tiberius, who began referring to him as the perfect student. The boy who had once wept at his father's funeral now watched others suffering with scientific detachment, cataloging their reactions for future reference. The final test came in 31 AD when Tiberius ordered Caligula to personally execute a young slave girl who had attempted to escape the island. The method was left to Caligula's discretion, providing an opportunity to demonstrate his complete transformation from victim to perpetrator. Contemporary accounts describe the execution as a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Rather than choosing a quick death, Caligula devised an elaborate scenario that maximized the victim's psychological torment while providing entertainment for the island's elite. He spent days preparing the girl mentally, alternating between false hope and crushing despair, before finally implementing a death that lasted hours. The psychological significance of this act cannot be overstated. By voluntarily choosing to inflict extreme suffering on someone who represented his former innocent self, Caligula completed his transformation from victim to monster. He had internalized his abuser's worldview so completely that he now derived genuine pleasure from others' pain. Tiberius was reportedly delighted by the performance, declaring that Caligula had achieved true imperial character. The emperor began making subtle preparations for succession, confident that his protege would continue his methods while being completely loyal to his memory. But Tiberius had made a crucial miscalculation. The psychological conditioning that had created Caligula's antisocial personality had also eliminated his capacity for genuine loyalty. The young prince's apparent devotion was merely another performance, masking a growing desire to surpass his mentor in both power and cruelty. In 37 AD, when Tiberius died, possibly with assistance from Caligula himself, Rome welcomed the young emperor with unprecedented enthusiasm. They saw the beloved son of Germanicus, the charming prince who had won their hearts as a child. They had no way of knowing that the island of Capri had systematically destroyed that child and created something infinitely more dangerous in his place. Modern psychology provides unprecedented insight into the mechanisms that transformed Caligula from beloved child to legendary monster. His case study represents one of history's most complete examples of how systematic abuse can create antisocial personality disorder, offering crucial lessons for understanding both individual psychological development and broader social dynamics. The conditioning process that occurred on Capri follows patterns that contemporary researchers have identified in cult programming, military psychological warfare, and totalitarian political systems. The isolation, gradual normalization of deviance, intermittent reinforcement, and systematic erosion of moral boundaries represent a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. Neurobiological research suggests that Caligula's brain development was fundamentally altered by his experiences. The chronic stress of his captivity would have damaged his hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, areas responsible for memory processing and impulse control. Meanwhile, his amygdala, the brain's fear center, would have become hyperactive, creating the paranoid hypervigilance that characterized his later reign. The timing of his abuse was particularly significant. Adolescence represents a critical period for brain development, when neural pathways are still forming and environmental influences have maximum impact. The systematic trauma he experienced during these formative years literally rewired his brain, creating the psychological architecture that would enable his later atrocities. His development of psychopathic traits follows patterns that modern researchers have identified in longitudinal studies of abuse survivors. The superficial charm, manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, and grandiose self-regard that characterized his adult personality represent predictable responses to specific types of childhood trauma. The intergenerational transmission of trauma is clearly visible in Caligula's case. Tiberius, who had himself experienced political persecution and social isolation, created similar conditions for his successor. This pattern, where victims become perpetrators who create new victims, represents one of psychology's most disturbing phenomena. The role of power in amplifying psychological damage cannot be understated. While many abuse survivors develop antisocial tendencies, few have access to the unlimited authority that enabled Caligula's extreme behavior. His case demonstrates how absolute power can transform individual psychological problems into civilizational threats. The survival strategies that helped Caligula endure his captivity, emotional numbing, strategic manipulation, and hypervigilance, became pathological when applied to normal social situations. The same psychological mechanisms that protected him from abuse made him incapable of healthy relationships or rational governance. His inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality reflects the complete breakdown of normal psychological boundaries. The extreme environment of Capri, where surreal behavior was normalized and genuine emotions were dangerous, created a mental framework that couldn't adapt to ordinary social reality. The sexual component of his abuse had particularly devastating long-term effects. The association between power and sexual domination, established during his captivity, became a central organizing principle of his adult personality. His later sexual crimes represented attempts to recreate and master the traumatic experiences of his youth. The broader implications of Caligula's story extend far beyond individual psychology. His case demonstrates how political systems can become mechanisms for creating and enabling monsters. The Roman Empire's concentration of power in a single individual, combined with its cultural tolerance for extreme behavior, created conditions where psychological dysfunction could metastasize into historical catastrophe. His reign also reveals how societies can become complicit in their own destruction. The same Roman citizens who had initially welcomed him continued to enable his behavior through their silence and submission. Fear-based compliance created a system where extreme behavior was not only tolerated but rewarded. The historical pattern of traumatized leaders creating traumatized societies appears repeatedly throughout human history. Stalin's paranoid policies, Hitler's systematic dehumanization, and Mao's Cultural Revolution all reflect similar psychological mechanisms operating on a civilizational scale. Caligula's case provides a clear example of how individual psychological damage can become collective historical trauma. The modern relevance of his story is particularly significant given contemporary concerns about authoritarian leadership and political polarization. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Caligula's rise, manipulation of mass emotions, normalization of deviance, and systematic erosion of institutional boundaries, remain relevant to understanding modern political phenomena. His case also provides insights into prevention and intervention. Early identification of psychological trauma, therapeutic intervention, and institutional safeguards against concentrated power represent practical applications of the lessons learned from his destructive reign. The story of Caligula's transformation from beloved child to legendary monster serves as history's most complete lesson in the psychology of evil. His case demonstrates with unprecedented clarity how systematic abuse can create individuals capable of unprecedented cruelty, while also revealing the social and institutional factors that enable such individuals to achieve positions of ultimate power. The 4 years that young Caligula spent on Capri represent one of history's most successful experiments in psychological conditioning. Tiberius's systematic destruction of the boy's moral framework, combined with his cultivation of antisocial traits, created a ruler whose capacity for cruelty surpassed even his teacher's expectations. The student had indeed surpassed the master, but in ways that would ultimately destroy them both. The implications of this transformation extend far beyond individual psychology. Caligula's reign demonstrates how personal trauma can become political catastrophe, how individual psychological dysfunction can destabilize entire civilizations, and how the concentration of power in damaged individuals can create lasting historical trauma. Perhaps most importantly, his story reveals the crucial importance of protecting children from systematic abuse. The innocent boy who charmed Roman legions with his curiosity and intelligence had the potential to become a great leader. Instead, the systematic destruction of his psychological development created a monster whose name became synonymous with depravity and cruelty. The modern world, with its sophisticated understanding of psychology and institutional safeguards against concentrated power, should theoretically be immune to such catastrophes. Yet the basic human vulnerabilities that enabled Caligula's transformation remain unchanged. Children are still vulnerable to systematic abuse, power still corrupts, and societies still struggle to balance security with freedom. The ultimate lesson of Caligula's story is not that monsters are born, but that they are made. The 11-year-old boy who entered Tiberius's court still possessed the capacity for love, empathy, and moral growth. The emperor who emerged 4 years later had been systematically stripped of these human qualities, transformed into something that could inflict unimaginable suffering without remorse. This transformation was neither inevitable nor irreversible. Different choices by the adults in his life, protection instead of exploitation, therapy instead of conditioning, love instead of manipulation, could have produced an entirely different outcome. The tragedy of Caligula is not just what he became, but what he might have been. His story serves as an eternal warning about the price of political expedience, the dangers of concentrated power, and the fundamental importance of protecting the vulnerable. In a world that continues to produce traumatized leaders and traumatized societies, the lessons learned from Rome's most psychologically damaged emperor remain more relevant than ever. The child who once brought joy to hardened soldiers became a man who brought terror to an empire. The transformation required only 4 years, but its consequences echoed through history for centuries. In understanding how such monsters are made, we take the first step toward ensuring they are never made again.